My name is Simon. I'm 28, and for as long as I can remember, birthdays in my family have been less about celebrating the person and more about proving who was worth more. My parents have always had this obsession with showing off their wealth through my younger sister, Emily. She's 22, and according to them, she's this perfect little trophy kid who deserves the world because, in their eyes, she's charming, smart, and basically flawless. Me? I've spent most of my life being compared to her, told I was less ambitious, not as presentable, or never appreciative enough. On paper, I was the responsible, hardworking one. They just never said it out loud. I guess I was supposed to silently swallow it. The birthday in question was supposed to be mine. I'd been looking forward to it quietly, not expecting extravagance or fanfare, just hoping for a decent meal and maybe some acknowledgement that I existed. But by the time my parents had Emily's party planned, complete with a rented hall, a chocolate fountain, balloons spelling out her name, and a lineup of gifts that would make anyone's jaw drop, I realized my expectations were way too high. Her gifts included a brand new iPhone, designer handbags, and even tickets to some exclusive concert she'd mentioned once, half-jokingly. My parents hovered around her like proud peacocks, taking photos, gushing, and making sure every relative knew how lucky she was to have them. I watched from the corner, smiling weakly, because I didn't want to be the bad sport, even though my chest felt tight and my stomach churned. When it came to my turn, the contrast hit me like a punch. My mom handed me a crumpled jacket, one that looked worn, faded, and clearly secondhand. "Be thankful for what you get, Simon," she said, with that smug smile she always uses when she thinks she's teaching me a life lesson. My dad, meanwhile, didn't even glance up from his phone as he added, "It's not like you're expecting a parade or something." Everyone clapped politely, and I forced a thank you, my fingers tight around the fabric of a jacket that had clearly seen better days. I don't know why, but something inside me snapped a little that day. I could feel my pulse in my temples as I glanced at the pile of pristine, untouched gifts around me. Emily's grin was radiant, and my parents were glowing with pride. And there I was, standing in a worn jacket, feeling small, unappreciated, and, most of all, disrespected. I left the party early, making some excuse about needing to run errands, but really, I was seething. I walked to my car, my mind spinning with every insult, subtle or not, that had been lobbed my way that night. The years of comparisons, the casual dismissal of my achievements, the way my parents had always prioritized Emily's happiness over mine. I parked in the quiet lot across the street and just sat there, my hands clenched, staring at the night sky. I thought about every dollar I'd earned from my job, every small victory I'd quietly achieved while they were busy fawning over Emily, and I realized something. They had assumed, for years, that I was just going to comply, silently absorb every indignity, and keep playing their game. But I wasn't. Not anymore. Over the next few days, I kept my distance, keeping a careful eye on their patterns, their credit cards, their bills, and the way they flaunted money without ever thinking about the consequences. I knew they were reckless, careless even, and it got me thinking about leverage, how I could use the one thing they'd always ignored about me, my financial independence. I had been saving diligently, putting money aside for emergencies, for my future, for things I actually wanted. And as I thought about that worn jacket, the dismissive tone, the smug satisfaction on their faces, a plan began to form. A quiet, calculated plan to make them understand what it felt like to be powerless in the face of entitlement. Every time I thought about my sister showing off her new iPhone or my mom posting yet another picture of Emily in her designer clothes, my jaw tightened. The injustice of it all felt tangible, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't just feel frustrated. I felt motivated. I wasn't going to yell or argue or beg for recognition. That was their way, and it had never worked. I was going to let my actions speak, quietly and efficiently, and if my parents thought they could humiliate me with a hand-me-down jacket, they had another thing coming. I just needed patience, timing, and the perfect opening. After that birthday, the atmosphere at home didn't improve, it only got heavier. I started noticing the little ways they'd reinforce Emily's superiority, the way it gnawed at me day after day. My parents didn't do it out of malice. They convinced themselves they were being fair, but the effect was suffocating. It started with small comments at dinner. "Simon, don't bother trying to decorate your apartment like Emily's. You don't have the same eye for style, my mom said one evening, her tone light but cutting. My sister laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder like she hadn't a care in the world. I barely ate, nodding and smiling, but inside, my chest tightened. Every word from them reminded me that no matter what I did, I was always going to be less than in their eyes. Then came the gifts, or rather, the lack of them. Emily would get expensive shoes she never asked for, jewelry she didn't need, or last-minute luxury trips my parents thought she deserved. Meanwhile, my attempts at anything significant, a promotion at work, a personal milestone, were either met with mild acknowledgement or completely ignored. One afternoon, I mentioned a bonus I'd just received at work, hoping for a hint of pride or even a good job. My dad barely looked up from his laptop. "That's nice, Simon. But Emily got a scholarship to that art program, remember? That's a bigger deal." I smiled politely, but inside, frustration coiled like a snake. The subtle manipulations were relentless. My parents would make plans, family outings, or vacations and automatically assume Emily's preferences over mine. We booked Paris for Emily's spring break. My mom told me casually one Saturday morning, "You'll understand if you can't make it, work and all." They never asked if I wanted to come, never considered if I might enjoy it. It wasn't even about being included. It was about making sure Emily always felt prioritized and I was quietly sidelined. The worst part was how they treated me financially. I had been the one footing bills for years without complaint, helping with utilities, groceries, and even insurance when their cards maxed out, all because they assumed I could manage. I was meticulous about it, paying everything on time, never asking for recognition. Meanwhile, Emily got a separate allowance, a credit card with a ridiculous limit, and every little whim catered to. I remember one night, reviewing my own statements, noticing the ridiculous sums my parents spent on luxury dinners, expensive gym memberships for Emily, or the new phone they'd gotten her right before my birthday. Meanwhile, when I had casually mentioned wanting a decent pair of boots for work, my mom had scoffed, "You have shoes. Stop being ungrateful." I kept my anger in check publicly, but inside, it festered. I realized I'd been playing their game of compliance for far too long. Every insult, every slight, every unfair comparison was stacking, layering on top of the quiet resentment I'd been carrying since childhood. It wasn't just about the jacket anymore. It was about every hand-me-down lesson, every dismissive nod, every instance where my needs and accomplishments were trivialized. They had been taking advantage of me for years, assuming I'd continue to pay their bills and swallow their favoritism without protest. And for the first time, I felt the urge to reclaim control, not in some childish tantrum, but in a smart, deliberate way. I started paying closer attention to how my parents handled money. They were careless with their credit cards, spending freely on things that made no sense, thinking I wouldn't notice. And I did. I had always been the responsible one, meticulous with my finances, saving, tracking everything. Slowly, I began seeing a pattern. They didn't realize I was the one covering most of their shortfalls, quietly transferring money, paying off overdrafts, and handling emergencies so that no one would notice. That knowledge gave me a strange sense of power. They assumed they were untouchable, that their entitlement was invisible. But I held a key they'd completely ignored, the financial lifeline they were living off. The tension reached a new level during a family dinner when Emily casually mentioned wanting a new designer jacket for an upcoming party. My mom immediately jumped in. "Of course, Emily. We'll get it tomorrow." Then, turning to me, she added without a smile, "Simon, you should be careful with spending. Remember, you have responsibilities." Everyone laughed lightly, like it was just a harmless joke, and Emily rolled her eyes, oblivious to the sting. I took a sip of my drink, keeping my face neutral while my mind raced. Responsibilities. Of course, my parents had framed me as the responsible one for so long that they expected me to fund their mistakes and smooth over their financial messes. And until now, I started thinking about what it would feel like if the roles were reversed. If they had to come to me, hat in hand, asking for money instead of taking it for granted. The idea grew into something almost tangible in my mind. A slow, calculated reversal where they could feel the helplessness I had lived with for decades. I didn't want to humiliate them in front of friends or family. I wanted to show them that entitlement has a cost, and I had the means to ensure they finally understood it. In the weeks that followed, the favoritism escalated. Emily's graduation came up, and naturally, my parents went overboard. They rented a hall, invited everyone in the family, and bought a stack of gifts that would make anyone's head spin. I quietly declined to bring anything myself, knowing my contributions would be ignored anyway. During the ceremony, my mom constantly whispered praises to Emily, pointed out every accolade she had, and my dad kept texting relatives, showing off how talented she was. I clapped along, smiled, and stayed out of the spotlight, but inside I was already strategizing. Even their friends started noticing the pattern, though no one said anything to me. At one brunch, a friend casually mentioned, "Simon, you always do so much for your family. Do they ever notice?" I laughed awkwardly, shaking my head. Not really. I think they just assume it's my job to manage everything. That comment stayed with me. They had assumed that for years, that I would continue to support them financially, emotionally, and socially without acknowledgement. They had assumed wrongly. I kept observing, making mental notes. My parents still left bills unpaid until I covered them. They maxed out their cards thinking I'd bail them out. And Emily, blissfully unaware of the burden I carried, continued to receive gifts and praise as though the world revolved around her. I knew that the tipping point was approaching. I just needed the right moment to flip the script. I began quietly pulling my own finances together even more, keeping precise records, monitoring credit lines, and making sure I had complete control. If they thought they could rely on me forever, they were about to be shocked. The tension reached its peak one Saturday morning when my dad came into my apartment, holding a stack of bills and a credit card statement. "Simon, this is getting out of hand," he said, looking frustrated. "I don't know how you keep paying for all of this. You're doing more than your fair share. Emily deserves her things. You need to understand your place." I looked at him, calm but resolute. "I understand my place perfectly, and I've been paying attention, more than you realize." My dad frowned, but before he could respond, I smiled politely and walked him to the door. Inside, my mind was racing with possibilities. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Years of resentment, frustration, and careful observation had culminated in a quiet awareness of my power. They had assumed I would continue to support them unquestioningly. They had assumed I was just a soft, responsible son who would never act on his own authority. And for the first time, I felt ready to challenge that assumption. It all came to a head about a week after I'd quietly finalized the last pieces of my plan. I'd been patient, watching, waiting, and making sure everything was in place. My parents had no idea how much control I actually had over their financial lifeline. They assumed that because I'd always been responsible, I'd continue to cover their mistakes without question. That assumption was about to be shattered. It started innocuously enough with my mom calling me in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was unusually sharp. "Simon, can you check on the credit card statement? There's something wrong. Some charges haven't gone through, and I don't know why." I stifled a small smile, keeping my voice neutral. "Sure, I can look at it." I pulled up their accounts on my laptop, the same ones I'd been monitoring for months. Everything was exactly as I had arranged. Their primary cards had hit the limit because I had paused automatic payments. Carefully, methodically, enough that no emergency alerts had triggered, but enough to cause immediate inconvenience. By the time I called back, my mom was frazzled. "Simon, what's happening? Why aren't the bills clearing? The utilities, the grocery card, even Emily's designer subscription, they're all failing." I kept my tone casual. "I'm not sure, Mom. Maybe you should contact the bank." I could hear the panic creeping into her voice. It was subtle at first, like a whisper of doubt, but I knew it would escalate quickly. It did. By mid-afternoon, my dad stormed into my apartment, papers in hand, his face flushed. "Simon, this is ridiculous. Our cards are being declined everywhere. How could this happen?" I met him calmly, letting him see the same level-headed son they had always underestimated. "Dad, I've been managing the accounts for a while now. I noticed you've been overextending, so I put a pause on certain payments until you're more careful." His jaw tightened. "Pause? You don't understand. This is urgent." I shrugged, letting the weight of responsibility hang between us. The same weight they'd always expected me to bear without complaint. The betrayal hit hardest with Emily. She had no idea what was happening. That night, she came bursting into my apartment, tears streaming down her face, holding her phone like a lifeline. "Simon, I can't even order a cab. My subscription got canceled, my online shopping won't go through, My wallet is empty. What's happening? My stomach twisted because part of me felt a pang of guilt. I knew she wasn't responsible, but she had been complicit in the system that rewarded her every whim. I knelt beside her, softening my tone, though inside I felt a grim satisfaction. Emily, I think it's finally time you understand how it feels when someone else controls the money. This is what it's been like for years. Her eyes widened, the realization dawning slowly, painfully. You did this? She asked, voice shaking. Simon, why? I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for a moment, letting her absorb the full weight of what had happened. Because you've been given everything while I've been doing everything. And nobody, especially mom and dad, noticed. They think entitlement is a reward, but it's a choice they made. And now it's catching up to them. I could see the shock ripple through her, that first glimmer of fear that I had never seen before. Emily had always been untouchable, floating above reality in her perfect little bubble of praise and gifts. But now that bubble was cracking, and she realized for the first time that her world could collapse without warning. She looked at me, disbelief painted across her face. Simon, this isn't fair. Mom and Dad, they'll hate you. I nodded calmly. They already hate me in some ways, but they'll also learn to respect me in ways they never have. And maybe, just maybe, they'll understand how much I've done for them all this time. The next morning, the fallout began in earnest. My parents called in a frenzy, harassing me with frantic questions, accusations, and demands. Simon, this is absurd. Our accounts are frozen. We can't pay rent. We can't cover utilities. What have you done? My response was measured, precise. I paused the payments until you're responsible. You've relied on me for too long without acknowledging it. Consider this a wake-up call. The tension escalated further when family friends began noticing the strange behavior. Invitations went unanswered because cards were declined. Dinner reservations were canceled. Even small social gatherings were disrupted because my parents had no access to funds they assumed were endless. Suddenly, the perfect image of my family, the wealthy, charming, untouchable household, was unraveling, thread by thread, and I was the calm eye in the storm, the one they had underestimated for years. The betrayal was especially sharp when my mom tried to corner me at home a few days later. She approached cautiously, trying to regain control. Simon, this has gone too far. You're my son. We've always. I thought we were family. I looked her in the eyes, my voice steady, unwavering. I am your son, but being family doesn't mean taking advantage of me. You assumed I'd always bail you out. You assumed I'd be the invisible safety net while Emily got everything. That assumption is gone now. Her face crumpled with a mixture of confusion, frustration, and anger. I watched her shift, trying to manipulate me with guilt, trying to regain the upper hand in the same way she had my entire life. But it didn't work. Not this time. Not when I held all the cards, literally and figuratively. And for the first time in my life, I felt fully in control of the narrative. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, listening to the distant sounds of my parents panicking on the phone, Emily pacing anxiously, and the hum of my laptop displaying their frozen accounts. I didn't gloat. I simply let the moment exist. The betrayal had been carefully executed, surgical in its precision, and yet the emotional toll was undeniable. Seeing their panic, their helplessness, and the realization on Emily's face that her entitlement wasn't guaranteed, it was powerful. At the same time, a small part of me worried. Did I go too far? Could I have handled it differently? But the other part, the part that had spent decades overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed, rejoiced quietly. Finally, they were facing consequences for the patterns they had allowed, the favoritism they had reinforced, and the disrespect they had shown me. The balance had shifted, and for the first time, I wasn't just Simon, the responsible son. They were relying on me, aware of my influence, and forced to confront their own entitlement. I didn't hear from them directly for the next 48 hours. Emily texted a barrage of panicked messages, and my parents were reduced to sending vague, increasingly desperate emails. But I stayed calm, letting my silence speak. Let them stew in their confusion and frustration. Let them see that the one they had always underestimated was the one holding everything together. And as I watched the chaos unfold from a distance, a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension settled over me. The betrayal had been executed flawlessly, but the aftermath was unpredictable. For years, I had been patient, careful and silent, observing every slight, every manipulation, every moment of favoritism. Now, everything was in motion, and there was no turning back. The emotional turning point had arrived. They had no idea how much control they had relinquished and how much they had underestimated me. After the initial shock of the frozen accounts, life at home became a tense, almost unbearable fog. I could feel the weight of their panic pressing down on me, even though I had deliberately stepped back from active interference for a while. I watched my parents scurry around, frantically trying to figure out why their money wasn't available, their entitlement colliding with a reality they had never been forced to face. Emily was in tears most of the time, calling me at odd hours, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. Every call, every message, felt like a small betrayal of the quiet part of me that still cared about her, that didn't want her to suffer unnecessarily. But I couldn't show weakness, not yet. And yet, in the quiet moments, I began to feel the weight of my own decisions. I was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. The adrenaline from the initial strike of my revenge had faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Sitting in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I was finally confronting the full cost of taking control. This wasn't just a game of financial leverage. This was my family unraveling because of choices I had made. For the first time, I questioned whether I had gone too far. I thought about my parents, the people who had failed to see me, failed to appreciate me, failed to recognize my years of quiet sacrifice, and I felt a strange, conflicted sorrow. They had been toxic, manipulative, and unfair, but still, they were my family. Emily's messages kept coming, some angry, some pleading, all frantic. She didn't understand the years of subtle abuse, the constant comparisons, the way I had been expected to carry responsibilities that were never mine to begin with. She didn't see how often I had bailed them out, covered their mistakes, and smoothed over their recklessness. All she saw was a brother who had turned against them, a brother who had violated the unspoken rules of family loyalty. I read each message and let them sit, unanswered, because I knew that if I responded too soon, too emotionally, it would ruin the careful control I had built over the situation. The hardest moments were the quiet evenings when I was alone. I'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, my mind spinning. I felt guilt for Emily, frustration at my parents, and an unsettling loneliness that came from knowing that for the first time in my life, I was on my own, even in the midst of my family. I had expected relief or even a sense of triumph after executing my plan, but instead, I was met with a hollow echo of what I had done. The reality of it, the emotional and psychological toll, was heavier than I had anticipated. The days blurred together. My parents tried to reach me in person, standing outside my apartment, knocking at the door with increasingly desperate faces. I refused to answer, watching from behind the blinds as they paced the sidewalk, occasionally muttering to each other in frustrated tones. Emily would sometimes hover near the doorway, her designer jacket hanging awkwardly on her small frame, looking helpless. I had to remind myself constantly, none of this was truly about hurting her. It was about accountability, about teaching a lesson that no one else seemed willing to deliver. Still, the burden of witnessing their panic and feeling the guilt of orchestrating it weighed on me more than I had expected. In the quiet solitude, I began to reflect on my own life in ways I hadn't allowed myself before. I thought about the years of quiet compliance, the way I had bent over backward to support them emotionally and financially, and the resentment I had swallowed to maintain peace. I realized that while my plan had given me power, it hadn't freed me from the emotional chains of my past. The burden of being the responsible one, the one who was always ignored and dismissed, was heavier than I had anticipated. It was during one of these long nights that I first seriously considered walking away. I imagined a life where I had no responsibility for their mistakes, no obligation to smooth over their recklessness, and no need to absorb Emily's entitlement. I pictured leaving the city, finding a small apartment somewhere far away, and cutting all ties until they learned to respect me, or at least learned to survive without me constantly covering for them. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. I could see myself finally breathing, finally existing without the weight of their expectations and comparisons pressing down on me. And yet, even as I toyed with the idea of leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that walking away entirely would feel like admitting defeat. It wasn't just about the money or the frozen accounts. It was about finally being acknowledged, about proving in the most undeniable way that I had been undervalued for years. Leaving now would mean abandoning the one tool I had to demand respect and recognition. I had to remind myself, patience, timing, precision. I couldn't let emotions dictate my next move. As the days went by, their desperation grew more pronounced. My parents began arguing constantly, the stress of the frozen finances magnifying every tiny disagreement. Emily started blaming herself, thinking that her extravagant habits had somehow caused the chaos. Watching them unravel was hard, painful, even, but it was also a confirmation that my plan was working exactly as intended. They had taken me for granted for years, and now, finally, the tables had turned. The balance of power had shifted. In the midst of all this, I kept working quietly on the next steps. I reviewed all their accounts again, double-checked the payment schedules, and made small adjustments that would continue to keep them on edge. Every action was calculated, every move deliberate. I wasn't acting out of malice. I was acting out of years of neglect and disrespect, years of carrying burdens no one else noticed or cared about. And yet, I felt the emotional strain mounting with each passing day. The weight of responsibility had never felt heavier, not when I was covering for them, not when I was ignored, and not now, when I held their entire financial world in my hands. Late one night, as I stared at my laptop, reviewing the frozen accounts for what felt like the 100th time, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. I was at rock bottom emotionally, torn between guilt, frustration, and the quiet satisfaction of finally holding power, but I also began to see the path forward. I realized that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my life, setting boundaries that had never existed, and finally prioritizing myself after decades of being second to Emily. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about what I wanted without worrying about how it would inconvenience my parents or disrupt Emily's perfect little bubble. I thought about moving, saving, traveling, and living in a way that was entirely mine. And yet, as liberating as that vision was, I also felt a simmering resolve. Leaving would be easy, but making them recognize their entitlement, forcing them to confront the consequences of years of neglect, that would be infinitely more satisfying and infinitely more dangerous. By the end of that week, I was exhausted but resolute. I had suffered emotionally, walked through the guilt and second-guessing, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of my actions. And now, at rock bottom, I began quietly plotting the next stage. This wasn't just about freezing accounts or temporary chaos. It was about long-term control, about teaching them a lesson they would never forget. I started making lists, noting vulnerabilities, mapping out the ways I could leverage their dependency on me without tipping into chaos that could backfire. I realized that patience was my greatest weapon. They were panicking, desperate, and vulnerable, but they still underestimated me. They had assumed I would bend, forgive, and absorb the damage silently. They assumed I was just Simon, the responsible son, the overlooked sibling. And now, from rock bottom, I was quietly preparing to rise above it all, not with anger, but with calculated, deliberate action. The hardest part was that I couldn't let them see any of it. Every interaction required a mask of calm neutrality, a polite acknowledgement of their panic, even as I plotted the next moves. Emily's cries, my parents' frantic calls, their anger and confusion, it all became part of the landscape I navigated silently, like a chess player moving pieces without touching the board. I was still suffering, still shouldering the emotional cost of every decision. But I knew that each day of endurance, each careful adjustment, brought me closer to the moment when the full impact of their entitlement would finally crash down on them. And in those quiet, exhausting moments, I realized something essential. I wasn't just taking revenge anymore. I was reclaiming my life, my respect, and my sense of power. The emotional lows, the guilt, and the sleepless nights were simply part of the price I had to pay to rewrite the rules they had imposed on me for decades. The storm was far from over, but I could feel it building, palpable and inevitable, like a distant thunder that promised a downpour unlike anything they had ever experienced. After weeks of emotional exhaustion and carefully watching my family flounder, I began to notice a strange shift in myself. The constant tension, the weight of responsibility, and the careful orchestration of their panic had left me drained. Yes, but it had also sharpened me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally operating from a place of control rather than reaction. The chaos at home no longer consumed me. Instead, it had given me clarity. I realized that while my family was unraveling, I had the opportunity not just to assert my power over them, but to build my own life in a way I never had before. I started small, at first just with myself. I reorganized my finances, separating personal savings from the money I had been quietly using to cover my parents' recklessness. It felt almost indulgent, like taking the first deep breath after a long period of drowning. I had a clear vision now, a life untethered from their entitlement, one where I could finally invest in myself, pursue opportunities I'd put off, and plan without interference. I enrolled in a professional development course I'd always wanted to try, one that promised networking connections and skills that could significantly increase my career prospects. I could feel the confidence building inside me with every class, every project, every new contact. While my parents and Emily were still struggling with frozen accounts and unpaid bills, I was quietly creating momentum in my own life. I negotiated a raise at work, leveraging the skills I had developed over the years and my years of diligence that had often gone unnoticed. I was careful not to flaunt it. After all, visibility would have tipped my hand, but the sense of independence it gave me was intoxicating. Suddenly, I had not just control over my family's financial lifeline, but over my own trajectory. I had options, freedom, a sense of power I hadn't realized I'd been craving for decades. But I didn't stop there. I began to research more deliberate ways to leverage my position without seeming overtly aggressive. I looked into financial structures, automated payment systems, and account protections that would allow me to hold their resources under my control while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing a long-term strategy. I realized that patience had always been my strength, but knowledge was the real key. The more I learned, the more advantage I could create. Meanwhile, the tension at home didn't let up, and that actually helped me. Every frantic call, every desperate text from Emily, every panicked meeting my parents had with banks or credit counselors only reinforced my position. They were flailing, and I was calm, methodical, and deliberate. I never raised my voice, never let anger seep into my tone. I simply remained the responsible one, the rational one, while letting them crumble around their own assumptions. And in the process, I began to see the cracks in their dynamics, small weaknesses I could exploit when the time came. One evening, my mom cornered me in the kitchen. She was visibly flustered, trying to project authority, but failing under the strain of her own panic. "Simon, we need to fix this. You can't just, what you're doing is unfair." I met her calmly, placing my hands on the counter. "I'm not doing anything unfair. I'm making sure you take responsibility for your choices. For years, I've managed everything while you assumed I would, and now it's time to recalibrate." She blinked, clearly unsettled, and I could see the doubt creeping into her mind. For the first time, she didn't have a ready excuse, and it was a small, quiet victory. Around the same time, I started making small investments with my own money, ones that I had postponed for years. I researched stocks, small business ventures, and other opportunities that could build my independence even further. The thrill wasn't in money alone. It was in finally having control over my own life, in creating a safety net that was mine and mine alone. I could feel my confidence growing, like a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. Emily, oblivious to the full scope of my strategy, continued to panic. She would call, frantic, asking for help with bills, subscriptions, or even minor purchases she had assumed would always be covered. I responded sparingly, offering vague guidance, but never actually doing anything for her. It was difficult at first. I had been the one to bail them out for so long that restraint felt almost unnatural, but I reminded myself constantly. This was part of the lesson. They needed to learn what it felt like to rely on someone who would not be manipulated, to understand the weight of entitlement and complacency. The biggest turning point came when I discovered something critical about their finances. Despite the panic and their frantic scrambling, they had no real oversight of their accounts. They relied entirely on me to monitor balances, authorize payments, and cover overages. They had assumed that this reliance was permanent, unquestionable, unchallengeable. That assumption was a mistake, a colossal, strategic error that gave me leverage I could use to orchestrate the next stage. I began quietly compiling a file of every oversight, every reckless expenditure, every emergency I had covered for them. I documented the way they had consistently prioritized Emily over me, the way they had relied on my labor and my money without acknowledgement or gratitude. It was meticulous work, slow and precise, but it gave me not only a roadmap of leverage, but also a psychological boost. I was no longer the overlooked son. I was the one with knowledge, power, and patience. Life outside the family also started improving in subtle but meaningful ways. I began spending more time with friends, engaging in hobbies I had neglected, and even taking short trips for personal growth. I felt the liberation of focusing on myself. And yet, even as my own life blossomed, I maintained the quiet observation of my parents and Emily. Every movement, every decision they made was data. Every moment of panic, every desperate email, every interaction reinforced the structure I was building for the next phase. In one particularly telling incident, Emily tried to guilt me into paying for a new subscription she insisted she needed for work, something she had never bothered to check herself. I calmly reminded her that all financial support had limits, that she had relied on me far too long, and that this was no longer acceptable. Her face went pale, her voice faltering as she realized that the safety net she had assumed was endless had disappeared. It wasn't malice, it was accountability, but the effect was just as powerful. I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that life without my silent support was suddenly a harsh reality. I also started thinking strategically about the future. My career, my savings, and my personal growth were all aligned to create leverage, not just to free myself, but to ensure that when the time came, I could operate from a position of undeniable authority. I began exploring legal knowledge, understanding my rights and the ways I could ensure my independence from family interference. I wasn't planning to ruin them maliciously. I was planning to create consequences that were entirely proportional to years of entitlement, favoritism, and manipulation. Slowly, I felt myself transforming. The exhaustion from the rock-bottom phase had given way to a sense of control, and control bred confidence. I was no longer reacting to their panic or their entitlement. I was actively shaping outcomes, building an unshakable foundation for myself while leaving them to flounder in the consequences of their own assumptions. Every day, I felt more capable, more powerful, more deliberate. And yet, I knew that the true test, the part that would finally make them recognize my worth, was still ahead. For now, I continued to rise quietly, letting my life improve while their world teetered. I cultivated independence, knowledge, and leverage, all while observing their panic with a careful, restrained patience. I wasn't just preparing for revenge. I was preparing for a reckoning that would be inescapable, undeniable, and meticulously executed. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the storm that had begun weeks ago was building toward a climax that neither Emily nor my parents could see coming. And in the quiet of my apartment, after another long day of work, study, and strategic planning, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I was no longer the overlooked, undervalued son. I was Simon, the one with power, patience, and purpose, the one who had endured years of entitlement, disrespect, and favoritism, and who was now quietly preparing to rewrite the rules of engagement entirely. The next phase was coming, and when it did, they wouldn't just notice. I would make sure they felt it fully and without the slightest possibility of ignoring or dismissing it. The months of planning had a quiet, surgical rhythm to them. Late nights with spreadsheets and bank alerts, careful conversations with a small, trusted circle of friends who'd help me think through the logistics, and a couple of discreet consults with a financial advisor I could actually afford now. I never wanted drama for drama's sake. The whole point, always, was to be smarter than the chaos they'd created, to make the lesson inevitable but controlled. Revenge, to me, had to be neat, painful enough to register, fair enough to be defensible, and framed in a way that forced them to confront what they'd done for as long as they'd done it. Execution day arrived on a Tuesday, not for any symbolic reason, just because timing mattered and Tuesday fit into my work schedule. I had spent the previous week slowly reinstating some payments to keep the panic simmering rather than boiling. Utilities here, a grocery card there. Enough that they wouldn't completely collapse, but not enough to let them relax. It kept them scrambling, which let me observe patterns and adjust. I wasn't cruel. I was deliberate. My plan had three parts: financial containment, legal structure, and a public but not humiliating confrontation that forced them to acknowledge the imbalance. The containment was already in motion: locked accounts, paused cards, and the careful routing of a few discretionary expenditures into an account I controlled. The legal structure was the part I'd finessed over the last month. A repayment agreement drawn up by the financial advisor and a lawyer friend, outlining the years of payments I'd made on their behalf: groceries, utility surcharges, insurance overages, the value calculated conservatively, and a reasonable payment schedule tied to concrete milestones. It wasn't punitive in numbers, it was precise in documentation. The point wasn't to bankrupt them. The point was to make them see the ledger of their entitlement. The confrontation would happen at home, in our living room, the same room where my sister's parties were staged, where my parents had practiced their pride. I invited them for dinner under the pretense of family meeting. Nothing serious, just talk. My mom was suspicious but flattered. They always liked to be included in anything that sounded important. Emily assumed it was another photo opportunity. They all showed up dressed in the same casual, surface-bright cheer that had always driven me crazy. Smiles that never reached the eyes, laughter timed for cameras, the practiced charm of people who never considered consequences. I cooked that night. It felt oddly domestic, almost banal. Pasta, salad, something warm to cut through the tension. I set the table like I always had growing up, and when they walked in, their faces relaxed into that parental, performative affection. For a second, it almost disarmed me. They hugged, they teased, they remarked on how grown-up I looked. "Simon, you're too old to make us pasta," my dad joked. And for a second, the boy who once wanted nothing more than a good word almost believed in the facade. Then I sat them down. I started soft. "I don't want to roast anyone tonight," I said, passing bowls around, watching them take food like nothing was wrong. "But I do want us to talk about how we take care of one another. That's all." My mom nodded, her expression generous, because she'd learned to expect sermons without consequences. My dad rolled his eyes just enough to show disinterest. Emily, in the corner, scrolled through her phone, half listening. I let the small talk die away and then unfolded the first piece of paper. It was a printed summary, clean, concise, and bland, the kind of document you'd find in an accountant's drawer. I'd kept the numbers conservative, nothing extravagant, just the truth. Amounts I'd covered, dates, short notes like emergency hospital copay, covered to avoid notice, and credit card overdraft, topped up. I handed my mother a copy and watched the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly when she took it. "You've been doing this for years," she said quietly, almost in disbelief. My voice was calm. "Yes, I have." I walked them through the ledger, one line at a time. There were times my voice cracked, because some of those entries were the only proof of years of unpaid labor, evidence that my quiet support had financed the comfortable little world they took for granted. But I didn't dramatize it. I stated facts, showed dates, and even included copies of old emails and bank reconciliations that matched the entries. I wanted this to be adult, clear, and undeniable. My dad's face went pale. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, louder than necessary. Emily looked up for the first time, confusion creasing her brow. "What is this, Simon?" she asked. Her hand shook as she set her phone down. "This is everything," I said. "The years you assumed would just be covered. The debt isn't about numbers, it's about responsibility. You all assumed I would be the invisible safety net. I'm not that anymore." I slid another page across the table, the repayment agreement. I explained the terms: a modest monthly repayment schedule, a clause that tied any missed payment to a temporary freeze on discretionary cards, luxury spending, subscriptions, etc., and a provision that required an annual family meeting to review finances openly. I wasn't demanding public admissions or screaming apologies. I was asking for accountability and transparency. My mother began to cry quietly, not a theatrical sob but small, penetrating sobs that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. "You don't understand," she whispered. "We weren't trying to hurt you. We wanted them to have things." My hands tightened on the table. "You wanted Emily to have things," I corrected softly. and you assumed I would handle the rest. That's different." There was a silence heavy enough to feel physical. My father stood abruptly. "This is extortion," he said, voice sharp, eyes darting to the lawyer friend I'd called to be present in case things went south. He was angry in a way that felt defensive, less about the numbers and more about losing the narrative. "You can't force us to sign." "Oh, I'm not forcing anything," I said. "You're free not to sign, but understand the consequences. I can withdraw my assistance permanently. The emergency fund I set up, it's for the family's safety net, but I control the release. If you refuse to acknowledge the imbalance and commit to change, I walk away. You'll be on your own with whatever debts you're carrying." I watched the gears turn in my father's head. For the first time, the facade of invincibility cracked. Emily, who had spent her life floating above reality, finally understood the stakes. "You can't do that," she said, voice brittle. "Why would you? We're family." There was hurt there, real, unvarnished hurt, and also the dawning comprehension that she'd been living in a bubble patched by others' labor. She flung out the predictable line they'd always used on me. "You're making this about money." I swallowed down the reflex to snap. "It's never just been about money," I replied. "It's about respect." Things escalated quickly after that. My father shouted, then cursed under his breath, a mix of anger and a kind of calculation that tries to regain control by bluster. My mother alternated between tears and bargaining, offering apologies that felt rehearsed and hollow. Emily kept glancing at me with this fragile, pleading look I'd never seen before. For the first time, she seemed aware that the world she'd been handed could be taken away with a few signatures and a few firm boundaries. My financial advisor spoke quietly into my ear at one point, a reminder of the legal frictions. Contracts needed witnesses, signatures had ramifications, and there was a line between moral retribution and legal overreach. I'd already thought of that meticulously. I wanted this to be defensible. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted them to admit they'd been dependent and to take steps to be better. The agreement on the table reflected that. It would give them a path forward and tie their comfort to actual responsibility. Then my father did something I didn't expect. He lunged across the table, slamming his hands down in a theatrically indignant way, and grabbed the top document, the repayment agreement, yanking it toward him as if to tear it. "You think this piece of paper changes anything? You think signing this means you win?" His face was red, veins prominent. The sudden violence of the gesture made my heart skip. I kept my hand still. "No," I said quietly. "This isn't about winning. If you're unwilling to acknowledge what's been happening and agree to change, I'll do the only thing that will force you to. I'll remove my support. You'll have to live within what you earn. You'll have to face creditors you've ignored. You'll have to ask for help, not assume it. And you'll have to do it without considering yourselves entitled." My mother clapped a hand over her mouth and sobbed harder. Emily stood frozen, torn between pleading with our parents and looking at me for mercy. My dad's face shifted from anger to something colder, calculation again. He looked at the lawyer, at the advisor, then back at me. "You're blackmailing your own parents," he said, so quietly it could have been an accusation or a diagnosis. "You want control. I want fairness," I corrected. "I want acknowledgement. I want boundaries. And I want you to stop pretending you can live on other people's labor." My voice was steady, and I could feel something inside me that had been building for years. This long, patient bank of anger and disappointment, finally fueling a quiet, resolute center. And then Emily did something that split the room. She sank down on the couch and began to cry. Not the practiced, self-absorbed tears she'd flashed for cameras, but raw, real sobs. "Please," she said between breaths. "Please don't take everything." I didn't mean. Her words collapsed under the weight of our history, and for a moment the room felt like it had collapsed into itself. Three adults who were also children wounded by the same family architecture. My father looked like he might sign out of exhaustion. My mother, broken and pleading. Emily, desperate. I could see 1,000 ways the scene could end, some of them ugly, some of them poisonous, some of them small and conciliatory. I'd expected bargaining. I'd even anticipated guilt. But I hadn't counted on how much their fear would feel like a wound in me. Watching them scramble, seeing Emily's face as she realized she'd been complicit in her own safety net, filled me with a strange relief and an unexpected tenderness. I slid back my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I don't want to ruin you," I said. I don't want to humiliate anyone. I want us to be able to sit at this table without pretending. I want us to be honest about who does what and who pays for what. This agreement isn't a trap, it's a chance. The room hummed with the static of unspoken history. My dad's jaw worked as he stared at the paper, the lawyer's pen hovering near the signature line. Emily's tears slowed to hiccups. My mother's hands trembled. She looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And then, right as my father reached for the pen, right as the first drop of what could be a real reconciliation hovered in the air, there was a sound at the door, tires screeching outside, a raised voice from the street, and the bright, sudden ring of our home phone. Everyone looked up. The moment fractured. For an instant, we were all pulled out of that delicate equilibrium, and the question in the room shifted from whether they would sign to what had happened outside. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand and fled to the window. My father swore under his breath. My mother's tears froze. I watched all of them, feeling the full weight of what I'd set in motion. A choice, now within reach for any of us to make. The pen hovered and signed. The air felt electric with possibility and dread. I felt a thin thread of victory and the thin prick of doubt, both at once. And then someone pounded on the front door, insistent, urgent. The lawyer stepped forward, cautious, while my father's face drained of color. Whatever happened next would change everything. But I wasn't going to close the door on the moment that would force them to reckon. I stood, listening to the frantic knock, my heart beating steady. Because for the first time in my life I knew I had not only given them a choice, but had also given myself one. I could demand the acknowledgement I'd waited for, or walk away and keep the ledger private. The knock was louder now. My dad swallowed and reached for the knob. The door opened, and whatever stood on the threshold, what consequence, what revelation, what outsider, pulled at the thread of our fragile, years-in-the-making reckoning. The room held its breath with me. The knock on the door was the catalyst, the final spark that would tip the carefully stacked balance of the evening. My dad's hand hovered over the knob, pale and hesitant. I could see the calculated anger on his face fighting with the realization that he had no control over the situation. My mother, still trembling from the confrontation, clutched at her sweater as though it were armor against what was about to unfold. Emily stayed behind the couch, wiping tears and clutching her phone like it could call a lifeline into existence. When the door opened, it revealed a familiar figure, the building manager, holding a stack of official notices and a firm expression. He didn't need to explain. The envelope of letters and the stack of account statements spoke for themselves. Months of accumulated notices, utility late payments, tax reminders, and minor infractions had been delivered in a single, unignorable moment. The sight of them left my parents frozen. This wasn't a judgment I was handing down. It was reality finally landing squarely on their doorstep. Simon, my mother's voice trembled. She sounded like she might beg, cry, or explode, all at once. But I remained calm, seated at the table, leaning slightly back in my chair. Everything is right here. You can either acknowledge it and act, or continue ignoring it. My tone was neutral, measured. The power wasn't in the words. It was in the way I was present, unshaken, fully aware of the truth. The first wave of consequences hit instantly. My father, in his panic, tried to rush through the papers, scanning for mistakes, but the details were meticulously documented. Each line highlighted years of over-reliance on me. Every emergency I had quietly covered. Every bill that had been swallowed up to keep their world spinning. This isn't fair, he finally whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But fairness was irrelevant here. The ledger was indisputable. For the first time, he had no plausible way to argue, no room to manipulate the narrative. Emily's shock was the most visceral. She had spent her entire life enjoying luxury without consequence, assuming that the family finances were infinite and that I was the invisible repairman. Now, as the reality of the repayment plan and the accounts hit her, she crumpled slightly on the couch, her phone discarded. I didn't realize, she said, voice small, almost lost. Her entitlement had been comfortable, unchallenged, and now it was crumbling in real time. Over the next hour, the fallout unfolded with a brutal elegance. My mother tried to call their friends and extended family, likely hoping for intervention or a sympathetic ear, but every explanation faltered under the weight of the truth. My father argued in private, behind closed doors, But the legal safeguards I had set up and the meticulous record-keeping left him no avenue for evasion. Their sense of superiority, the one that had guided decades of entitlement and preferential treatment, was eroding before their eyes. I could feel it, the shift in the energy of the house, the subtle way their confidence drained away. They weren't just shocked, they were humbled. Every small, dismissive remark they had ever made to me, every assumption that I would absorb their mistakes and support Emily, every comparison that had made me feel small, had led to this reckoning. It wasn't theatrical revenge. It wasn't dramatized humiliation. It was a precise, inevitable consequence of their choices finally manifesting in a way that they couldn't ignore. Emily finally looked at me, her eyes wide, searching for mercy or explanation. "Simon, are you serious about this?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, the first real vulnerability I'd seen from her in years. I nodded once, deliberately. "I am. Not to punish, not to hurt, but to make sure that this doesn't happen again. That all of us respect responsibility, accountability, and fairness. You've had comfort without consequence for too long." The quiet humiliation was suffocating and yet necessary. It wasn't about me being cruel. It was about making them feel the impact of their assumptions. My father sat back in his chair, fingers pressed to his forehead. My mother's tears had subsided into quiet sobs, her face pale and reflective. Even Emily's expression had shifted from anger to dawning comprehension. The lesson wasn't just financial, it was existential. The world didn't bend to entitlement, and the safety net they assumed was endless didn't exist without effort. Over the next week, the practical consequences hit hard. Their cards remained frozen until they signed the repayment agreement, a document that was fair, enforceable, and framed in terms of accountability rather than punishment. Every day, I monitored progress, not because I wanted to micromanage, but because I had finally recognized that years of neglect had created habits that would never correct themselves without clear structure. They learned, painfully, that the world required effort, honesty, and acknowledgement of others' labor. In parallel, I continued building my own life. My investments grew quietly but steadily. The professional contacts I had fostered in recent months bore fruit in the form of opportunities one hadn't dared to dream about before. For the first time, I had freedom from their chaos, not in absence, but in control. I could help if I chose, but I could also withhold, and the decision belonged entirely to me. Every interaction with my family reminded me that the leverage I had built was not just financial. It was emotional, psychological, and practical. Months later, after the dust had settled, the atmosphere in our home was irrevocably different. My parents and Emily approached interactions with an awareness they had never possessed before. They measured requests, considered the work behind any comfort, and, most importantly, they began to recognize my value. It was quiet, subtle acknowledgement at first, a thank you here, a pause before asking for help there, but it grew. The dynamic had shifted permanently. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat on my apartment balcony with a cup of coffee. I watched the city lights flicker in the distance, the same calm clarity I had felt during the months of planning washing over me. I had endured the disrespect, navigated the manipulation, and executed a plan that restored balance without descending into chaos. I had gained more than money or leverage. I had gained recognition, autonomy, and peace. When Emily called that night, it wasn't a plea or an accusation. It was a tentative check-in, her voice softer, her tone careful. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks. For everything. For helping us, for making us see." She didn't finish, but I understood. That moment, small as it was, crystallized everything. Years of tension, neglect, and favoritism had led to a reckoning, and finally, it had been acknowledged. I set down my coffee, feeling the satisfaction of restraint and intelligence. Revenge, I realized, didn't need to be dramatic or explosive. The most powerful retribution was subtle, precise, and undeniable. It didn't humiliate them for spectacle. It forced recognition, reflection, and change. And for the first time, I could exist in my family not as the overlooked son, the invisible provider, or the silent supporter, but as Simon, valued, respected, and in control. The night deepened, quiet and still. Somewhere down the street, life continued for everyone else, unaware of the shift that had taken place in our little corner of the world. I leaned back, took a slow breath, and let the sense of accomplishment wash over me. For decades, I had been ignored. For years, I had been undervalued. And finally, they had to see me. And I did.